In our last video, we created an animated bike rider that looked something like this here. Your character will look different, of course. This is my version of the animated character. I'm going to press Command Return on my Mac keyboard to show you what this animation looks like with the paddling and the hair flowing in the wind. And so this is our starting point for our next phase of this project here, where we're going to put this animated bike rider into a scene. And I'm going to give you a quick preview. This is what the scene looks like. And if I play this here, we have sort of a landscape scene that we drive through, and the bike rider comes into view, stays in place for a little while, and then after a few moments the bike rider speeds up and drives outside of the frame again. And we have a couple things going on in this animation, and that is different levels of hills, near hills that are moving by fast, somewhat more distant hills that are moving by a little bit more slowly to give you the proper parallax movements. In the very distance there is a cityscape that is actually the only thing in this project that is standing still. On top of that we have a sun that is slowly rising in on the horizon there, and then also a cloudscape that moves towards us overhead in a proper 3D perspective. So this is the plan, and in order to get started with this, I'm going to create a brand new project by going to File, New, and again this is the ActionScript 3 version, and I save it right away, and I give it a name for something like bike ride scene, and this is my YouTube version. Alright, so now we're ready to create assets here, and first thing we're going to do is import our bike rider as one package symbol. In order to get our animated bike rider packaged up so that we can reuse it in our new bike ride scene, I am going back to my project that contained just the bike rider by itself, and I'm going to package this entire animation up into a single symbol. I do this by either selecting everything that is on this stage here, and then I can go to Modify, Convert to Symbol, or I could also click and drag to highlight all of the keyframes. In the first frame will automatically select all of the assets that are in view right now and visible. I can go to Modify, Convert to Symbol, and I give this a name like Bike Rider Animated, something along those lines, and I click OK. This will create a new symbol in my library, and this symbol I can now copy and paste into my new project. So I select it, I right click on it and select Copy, and I switch over to my new project, and here I right click inside my library and I can select Paste. And this will import our bike rider animated symbol and also the three dependent symbols that are nested inside of our bike rider that's animated. So in order to see this animation working, I can select my frame 1 here, and I drag my bike rider animated symbol onto my stage, and it is static right now because I only have one frame. I'm going to actually slide over to frame 300. Our animation for this project will run about 300 frames. Right click on frame 300 and select Insert Frame. This will give me a timeline to work with. However, the animation is not executing yet, and that is because the symbol itself that we imported, if I double click on the bike rider animated, you can see here that the symbol itself only has a single frame in it. In order for this animation to execute, we have to provide enough frames for this animation to actually execute. So I right click on frame 16 and I insert a frame. Now I have the symbol itself. I'm allowing the symbol itself to animate. And if I go one level up to my main scene 1, now my bike rider is also animated on my main timeline. So this is a good first step, and next we're going to move the bike rider around so that he or she does not stay in place, but moves into the scene, stays put, and then moves out of the scene after a certain while. Before I actually animate the movement of the bike rider itself, I'm going to change my stage size just slightly from 550 to 700. It's not super critical exactly what these numbers are. I just want it to be a slightly more widescreen presentation for this project here. So I change it to 700 pixels by 400 pixels. And I also set the stage color itself to something that will give me some resemblance of a sky blue type color, something like that. So now I'm ready to animate my bike rider through the scene. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. I'm going to select my bike rider symbol and I move him up just a little bit by scrubbing on my Y position with the symbol selected. I can use my scrubber on the right side here to change the position. And I'm going to also move the X position to move the bike rider just outside of the frame at our beginning point. Since I want this whole animation to be later on using easing, and I'll explain later exactly what that means, I'm going to turn this timeline for this layer into a motion tween, which gives it a blue background. And before I get any further, I also need to name my layer. So now on frame 1, my bike rider is on to the left, just outside of the scene, and then we want to have about, not sure, let's say about 100 frames for the bike rider to move into the scene. So here on frame 100, I insert a new keyframe. I can go up here, insert timeline keyframe, and I move my bike rider into position by selecting the bike rider and then using my scrub element here to move him into position. So now my bike rider actually pedals into the scene and stays in place after frame 100. And we pretty much want him to stay there until about frame 200. The exact frames are not that important. I just want the bike rider to move into the scene, stay there for a while, and then speed up and move out of the frame again. So again, I'm inserting a new keyframe just to lock the bike rider into place, and then at the very end on frame 300 I insert another keyframe, and on this keyframe I want to change the X position again, and I do move the bike rider by scrubbing over the X position, and so that the bike rider moves out of the frame. And now my initial movement of the bike rider is somewhat complete here. Let me play this back. So the bike rider pedals into the scene, stays in place for a while, and after a few seconds the bike rider speeds up and moves out of the scene again. This is the basic movement. We'll fine-tune this later a little bit. As you notice, it comes to sort of an abrupt stop here, and then it starts up somewhat abruptly. We're going to smooth this movement out by creating easing. That means we are going to slow things down as the bike rider moves in, and then we slowly start him up again as he starts riding out of the scene. And that's the next step. In order to get the easing of the movement dialed in just so, one thing we have to do actually before we do that is split our motion tween, which currently is one continuous motion tween that goes from frame 1 to frame 300. I want to split it up into 3 sections actually, because the easing parameters apply to an entire motion tween. You can only set an easing parameter for an entire motion tween, and since I want to use 2 different versions of it, I have to split this current big motion tween into 3 individual ones. I can do that by selecting frame 100. This is where I want to transition from one motion tween to the next. If I command click on the PC, control click on this frame, I can then right click and under modify, where is it at? Split motion. This is what I want. This will split my motion into 2 different motion tweens. And we're going to do the same thing at frame 200, where I command click on the Mac, control click on the PC, and then go to modify timeline split motion. So when I do this, it should actually be near invisible that I made any change. So if I play this back, it should still look identical, I hope. There may be some fine-tuning. It stays in place for a while and then it moves out again. So now it still looks kind of abrupt, the stopping and the starting up again, but now I can select my first motion tween here that is running from frame 1 to frame 100. And if I zoom in a little bit, you can hopefully see this better, what I'm doing here. The green line shows us the movement of the little dots, and if I change the easing up here in the properties panel, there is an easing or an ease adjustment. Again, I can scrub to the left or to the right, and this was the wrong one. This means it starts up smoothly. You can see, I'm not sure that this shows up in the recording here, but the dots get very bunched together at the beginning and spread out further, meaning the movement starts slowly and comes to and then continues at a steady pace at the end. I want the exact opposite. I want it to start out fast and then come to a stop gradually. So I have to select my motion tween again, and I change my easing from minus to positive value to 100, which means it's easing out, meaning the end of my movement will come to a gradual stop. So let me play this back. Hopefully you can see that he moves in quite fast, and then he comes to a slow gradual stop and stays in place, and then he kind of jerks into motion again. So the stopping is smooth. Now I want to apply easing to the outgoing portion, and here I have to choose the minus 100 to make sure the movement starts out very slowly and then speeds up as the bike rider speeds up the movement. So let me play this back. Should come to a slow gradual stop, stay in place for a little while, and then slowly start up again and speed up and drive out of the frame. That is what I'm after here. There's a slight jerk right after he comes to the stop here, so I'm going to analyze that for a moment to make sure. It should be the exact same position. These 2 frames, it's slightly off. I'm not sure why it does that. I think this is a bug in Flash. But at frame 99, the X position is 88.5, and it should be the same on frame 100, so I don't have any movement. So here I'm just clicking and I type in 88.55, so that the movement is exactly in the same X position after it comes to a stop, and it should actually stay in the same position until the end. It may have a slight movement. There's no movement here at all, so now I have my movement nice and smooth, moves into the frame, comes to a nice gradual stop, stays there, and then has a very nice gradual start up again to move out of the frame. So this is what easing is about, to smooth out the movement, to come either to a gradual stop or to start up very gradually. And now that this bike rider is moving the way we want him to, we're going to add some scenery to this project here, and that's our next step. I've switched back to my already finished project that I showed you earlier just to illustrate or to show you some of the elements that go into the scenery. We have a couple different layers, one for hills near, which has a very long strip of sort of undulating hills with just a few tree elements or bushes in it. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. So this is the blue box is our stage, and as I move my timeline across, you can see as we animate this element, the hills are moving in front or from the right edge to the left edge to give the indication of movement. A second element is the far hills, which are, well, a very similar or related element. It's much shorter than the near hills because as we move over the timeline, the far hills that are further away, more in a distance, they move less than the hills that are nearby or nearer to us, to our viewpoint. The third thing is the element is the skyline. If I zoom in a little bit, you can see that a little better. It's just the skyline of a city, and this is actually very easy to produce using a built-in brush that Flash allows us to use to create sort of a cityscape. And then we have the clouds. These are a 3D shape that starts out as a flat shape, and we are going to rotate this pattern of clouds in 3D so that you can see this motion that is on a plane that looks like it's tilted towards us and above us. So as we move across the timeline, the shapes that are on this plane move towards us and get larger, giving the illusion of them moving in 3D space. And the last element that's going into the scene is the sun, which is a simple sphere with a glow, and it just rises very slowly over the course of the timeline. It goes up. And so these are the elements. I create different layers for each one of them, and I can animate them individually. Each one of them has a motion tween, except the skyline. Actually, the skyline doesn't move at all. It just is fixed in the scene for the entire duration. All the other elements have motion tweens that have a keyframe defined at the very beginning and a second keyframe at the very end. There's really nothing going on in the middle other than us allowing Flash to figure out all the intermediate frames for the motion tween. So let's get started with the skyline actually, because it's an easy one. I'm switching back to my new project here, and I'm going to create a layer for the skyline. And on this layer, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we see the whole frame. What I want to do is create this skyline, and there's a built-in tool into Flash called the Deco tool. There's many different effects that can be achieved with this Deco tool. I'm going to move my panels around a little bit. The one we're going to use, the drawing effect that we want to use, is the building brush. And there's different options. We're going to just use random building, so it varies it every time we draw. And the way this works, you just click and drag up, and it will give you a building. You click and drag up a second time, and make a couple short ones, make a couple longer ones, to give you sort of a quick and easy skyline of sorts. And we just want to hint at the cityscape that is in the distance here. So this is all that it's required to create the cityscape, and it stays in place, it stays fixed for the entire time. It needs to be, the layer for the skyline needs to be below the bike rider, so as we move our timeline across, the bike rider will move in front of the city, which is very far in the distance actually, which is why the city does not move relative to the bike rider when we are implementing this landscape that moves from the right to the left as the bike rider pedals. So the next element is the sun. Let's create the sun next. So I'm going to create a sun layer, and here I want to have the sun needs to be behind the skyline, and I'm going to use my drawing tool for oval tool. It's slightly outside the recording window, and I want to draw a circle that has no stroke color, and I want it to have a nice pleasing bright orange or yellow, and I hold down my shift key to create a perfect circle. And this sun here is going to be slightly behind the buildings here on frame 1, and I also want to give it a glow, to get a nice soft glow going for this element here. In order to do that, I have to turn this into a symbol. So right click here, and I can, from the drop down menu, can pick convert to symbol, or I can go up here, modify, convert to symbol, and this is my sun symbol. And now that I've converted it to a symbol, I can add a color effect under, actually it's not a color effect, it is a filter that I want to add. In order to add the filter that I want to apply here to give it a glow effect, I need to change the symbol type from graphic to movie clip. When I do that, I can, for one thing, give this instance a name. This is my sun, to stay with the same naming convention, for instance of my sun symbol. And now I can add a filter at the bottom that has a glow, for example. And here I can dial in a glow color of the same orange, and by tweaking the blur and the strength, just so you can hopefully see that the glow starts to appear in the image itself. So I just want to have the sun to have a very nice strong glow, and I think I want to dial up the strength quite a bit to get a really strong glowing effect of the sun here. So I'm happy with my glowing sun symbol. I need to animate it. I right click on my timeline to create a motion tween. It starts at this lower position here, and at the very end of my timeline I want to insert a keyframe, and I animate the Y position of my sun element, and it needs to come up. I want it to come up during the course of my animation. And if I play this back now, I should have the city in place. I'm going to, oops, I need to command return to play my movie. So the sun comes up very gently and slowly over the course of our animation here, and the bike rider stays in place and then moves out of place, out of the frame again. So this is my animated sun and the cityscape that is in place, and next up is going to be our hills that are going to be moving past at different speeds here, the near and the far hills. To create the hills, I'm going to use a symbol that will hold my hills. So I'm inserting a new symbol, and I call it hills. On this new symbol, I'm using my pen tool. Make sure my object drawing mode is active, and I draw sort of an outline of a hill outline here, of a hill structure. Shift click over here shift click up to get perfectly square baseline, and then I just sort of draw a somewhat random undulating hill scape. I close it, and I want to now change this hill element here to have it have a gradient. So I switch to my color palette here. I click on my fill color and choose linear gradient here. Now the colors, your default colors may be different. I chose 2 shades of green for my starting and my end color, just different shades of green here to indicate landscape, obviously. But this gradient by default runs horizontally. In order to make it vertical, there's a tool in your toolbar that is grouped together with the free transform tool, and it is called gradient transform tool. With this tool you can change what the gradient looks like. You can make it tighter, you can rotate it, which is what I want to do. So this here allows you to rotate the gradient, and you can make it squeeze down so that you have sort of a gradient that starts from light green at the top and goes to dark green at the bottom. You can move it down a little bit like so until you're happy with it. So this is my hill element here, my hill symbol that I can now use in my main timeline. And before I do that, I want to add just 1 or 2 trees actually. I'm using my deco brush or my deco tool. There's a tree brush similar to, this is the same selection where we had earlier a building brush. I'm going to use a tree brush, and you have your choice of trees. Just pick whatever suits your need. There we go. 1 here, 1 here. Doesn't have to be big. The fewer the better actually. We just want some indication of foliage on our hills here. There's maybe 1 more for a, let me see. There's also a flower brush, and I'm going to use a garden flower. Let's see what this looks like. Whoa, it's huge. Leaf size smaller, much smaller than that. So something like this here. So this is my hill symbol that I want to now use in my main timeline. So I'm going to show all. This is my main timeline. I want to create a new layer for hills near, and here's where I'm going to insert. On the first keyframe I'm going to drag my hills symbol onto my stage, and it comes in, well, much smaller than I want it to be, but I can change it around quite easily by using the free transform tool, and I can change the position and size of this element here. For example, the width I can stretch out quite a bit just by dragging out the width. Scrub element here, and then I position it, and I want it to be just not super wide, but I'm going to make it a little wider than it is right now actually. So scoot down, and I'm going to make it wider yet, and then position it so it starts in the lower left corner of my screen. It looks a little squished, but that's okay. We're not looking for hyper-realism here. We want to create some just sort of effect of hills and foliage and trees moving by. So this should actually be in place. It is static right now. I want this to be motion tween, so I right click on my timeline and create a motion tween. This is the starting point for frame 1. On frame 300 I want to change the position of this element here, and I use my X position scrub tool to position it to the left so that it aligns at the right edge of my screen, like so. And I'm actually going to leave it at this here and play it back and see whether this works. So now I should see sort of a slightly undulating hill structure here moving by with some plants nearby. So this is working out nicely so far here, just giving us a sense of movement. And we're going to add one more layer to this here, and that is our hills far. So hills far, and on this layer again I do the same thing. I just size my hills slightly differently, drag my hills symbol onto the stage. I want to size it and actually want to flip it as well, so it's going to be still a little wider but much less wide than the, oops, I don't want to shear it, I want to just move it so that it's quite a bit shorter than my original or my near hillscape, because when I move it I want it to move at a different speed. So I'm lining this up. The hills that are in the distance far need to be layered below so that they appear behind, and I'm going to make them a little bit taller too, just to give some variation, so you won't really be able to tell that it's the same symbol that I'm reusing twice here. And this is my starting point. I want to create a motion tween, and on the last frame I'm also going to move it into the new position, which is straight across. I hold down my shift key to make sure I move it perfectly horizontally, and now I should have a movement of both of these hills that are moving at a different speed, giving me a perception of depth as I'm playing this back here. I'm pressing Command Return to play this animation back, and now you can see sort of the near hills are moving faster than the hills that are a little farther away, giving us this depth perception. And also the squished and stretched hill symbols give us different size foliage and to give us variability, and it does not look like I'm using the same symbol twice. So this is pretty good for my hill movement here right now. So next up will be the cloud movement actually. For the last animated element of this scene, we're going to create clouds that will appear like they're moving in a 3D space. To get started, I'm going to create a new symbol, call it clouds, and I want this to be a movie clip, not a graphic, because for the 3D part we do need to have this, we do need this to be a movie clip. So it's just wide open. I'm going to create some white cloud shapes, and I'm going to use my brush tool, fill color set to white, and I'm just going to draw little shapes here. They won't look like clouds in the beginning, but if I move the stroke up a little bit, and I'm just, again, the intention here is to have some whimsical cloud shapes that we can imagine as you would see them from below, as you're looking straight up into the sky. That's what we're going for here. And I'll actually zoom out a little bit. I want this to be somewhat taller, a little bit too far. So I'm creating a few additional shapes at the bottom here, just drawing the outline roughly and then changing the stroke shape until my cloud fills in. So again, the exact shape is not important, just sort of a pattern of white dots. Doesn't look quite realistic right now, but I think when we turn this into a 3D movement of cloud shapes, it will look better. So here we are, my rough cloud shape. Oh, this is pretty rough, isn't it? Oh well, you can do better on your end, letting all your creativity flow into this cloudscape here. I want to just kind of move on with this part here, and I want to create a new layer called clouds, and this needs to be in front or on top of the sun, because they will be obscuring the sun as they move across the sky. Zooming out a little bit, I'm dragging my clouds layer onto my stage here, and here it is, looking just like flat, almost against the wall. I need to turn this into a 3D, or move it in 3D space. Up here under the tools, there's a 3D rotation tool that I can use to rotate things. And I have to always think about, see how this moves towards you when you click on the blue line, the second from the outside, and you can sort of turn it into this plane so that it looks like it is a plane that is sort of floating above us here. And for our starting point, I also want to move it, and I can change the X position by switching from the 3D rotation tool to the 3D translation tool. And now I can move it farther away for my starting point. I want this to be motion tween. This is my starting point. I move back to the end of my timeline, insert a frame here, a keyframe that is, and again I'm using my translation tool, and now I'm moving it forward, and hopefully you can see that this will move things, make things look like they're moving in a plane above us where the clouds would be moving. So if I play my scene back like so, this looks about right. So one final time for Command Return to play back the scene. And now I have my clouds moving in the sky, my sun is coming up, trees are floating by as my bike rider moves into place, keeps pace with us, and then the bike rider slowly speeds up and moves out of the frame. And this is pretty much it, what we had in mind here to create with the different elements. So this is all for now. Good luck with this project. I know there's a lot going on, but I'm hoping that you will have some fun with creating a little bike riding scene, putting different elements into it, and using all these different motions and also the 3D animation here to get a somewhat real, not necessarily realistic, but sort of a pleasing effect. So let your creativity reign here and come up with something beautiful. Alright, see you in class. Bye-bye.